Ms. Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
Now, to these people, apparently the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene. Well, you might just as well assume that you could repeal the law of gravity. The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationships between living things and between living things and their environment. You can't just step in with some brute force and change one thing without changing a good many others. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we must never interfere, that we must not attempt to tilt that balance of nature in our favor. But unless we do bring these chemicals under better control, we are certainly headed for disaster.
Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, environmentalism. Ever since the environmental movement exploded in the 1960s and 70s, with Silent Spring being published in 1962, the Cuyahoga River catching fire in 1969, the first Earth Day being celebrated in 1970, and the EPA being established that same year, works have been made actively promoting those ideals. Now, the idea that nature was being exploited by human industrial development is nothing new in art, stretching all the way back to the Romantic era in the 19th century. But environmentalism provided a framework for artists to set these stories and for corporations to make money off activist impulses. Most of these environmental stories were, frankly, terrible. They eschewed complicated reckoning with environmental ideas and instead turned toward moralistic platitudes about how terrible polluters are and how we need to live in peace with nature. These included shows like Captain Planet and movies like Fern Gully. This also led to the return of hackneyed stories where native peoples were portrayed as pure. This one-dimensional positive stereotype is better than the one-dimensional negative savage stereotype that dominated the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries and persisted into the 20th, but is still vapid and banal. These were films like Dances with Wolves, Pocahontas, and Avatar. In fact, the sheer number of environmental stories that are produced is in large part due to how simple they are to make. They don't require meditation on the systems that lead to this pollution and environmental devastation. They don't require criticism of those who don't actively encourage these processes but let them happen. They operate on a vapid moral logic. Polluters are bad, and thus those who stop them are good. Environmentalism is one of the most prominent causes promoted by celebrities because it's easy and very obviously important. You don't need to understand history or politics to give $1 million to a charity or create a foundation to protect the rainforest. I should make it clear that I am an avid supporter of environmentalism. It is extremely vital. Protecting our planet is perhaps the most important struggle we face today, but it is a struggle. There's nothing easy about it. Movies about environmentalism and the celebrities who dedicate themselves to the cause understand the physical challenges, but they don't understand the strategic and philosophical challenges. They see it as this anodyne struggle that everyone, except the wretched of the earth, can support. They don't see it as political, but it is innately political. The worst effects of climate change aren't occurring just because people are idiots or greedy monsters. There are those who feel that environmentalism comes at the expense of their livelihood or prosperity. Sometimes this is not true, but sometimes it is, especially in the global south. Celebrity millionaires blaming rising standards of living in impoverished countries for greenhouse gases is offensive at best. And even when this fear is not well-founded, these claims need to be dealt with, not simply ignored. The best and most effective environmentalism is not merely about individuals, it's about systems. Even the resistance to environmentalism that is caused by greed and idiocy needs to be analyzed, not merely opposed. How did the greedy attain the power they need for their greed to affect the environment? And why are people in America, as opposed to Western European countries, more likely to believe that climate change is a hoax? Great environmental works, which we're going to need as the global temperature continues to rise, deal with these questions, or at least separate themselves from the vapid cliché fests that have dominated environmental media. These cliché fests not only refuse to contend with these difficult questions, but actively deny the existence of these questions. So as to help guide a path forward, I'm going to briefly detail the radically different approaches taken by two pieces of art that take better perspectives toward environmentalist storytelling. Abzu, Visceral Imagination. While not as eloquent as Journey, the previous game directed by Matt Nava and scored by the peerless Austin Wintory, Abzu is still a gorgeously evocative game. It is not played so much as it is experienced. This is a phrase I realize is dreadfully overused, but if it applies to any game, it applies to Abzu. Journey unfolds in a willfully archetypical format. The game seeks to bring players together, despite cultural differences between them, by conveying a universal adventure. But Abzu is not about a propulsive experience, it's more about an immersive experience. It's about reveling in the ocean and the life forms therein. These life forms give the pieces of the soundtrack their titles, emphasizing how deeply the game focuses on teaching the player about these animals. And when I say teach, I don't mean in the didactic, scholastic way, though this does function well as an educational game. I mean in the deeper, more soulful way. You're not learning useless facts, you're learning emotionally. You're struck by the majesty and unity and awe of these creatures. The game's title comes from the name of the ancient Sumerian god of fresh water, but that name comes from the Sumerian words ab, or water, and zu, or to know, which is appropriate because this is a game about knowing, deeply and intimately, the grace and power of the ocean and all the life it holds. The ocean Abzu celebrates is not only a fertile ecosystem, but the primordial cradle of life. Because its reverence of the ocean is so sincere, and because it's a visceral enough game to translate that sincerity to the player, the environmental storyline of the game, which would have otherwise been lightweight, is given immediacy and gravitas. Princess Mononoke, Nuance and Empathy. Ghibli icon Hayao Miyazaki is an avid environmentalist. Even his films that aren't explicitly environmentalist, like My Neighbor Totoro and Ponyo, support a healthy relationship with the natural world. But he has made two films with overtly environmentalist messages. The first, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, is a fascinatingly creative and immense and ambitious film, but its environmentalist leanings hold it back, as the complexities that have been established earlier in the film are gradually rejected in favor of a belief system where the insect creatures the humans have been fighting are absolutely in the right, and the humans are absolutely in the wrong, even though the insects have caused no shortage of damage to the humans. It's a myopic narrative decision that stops the film from reaching the upper echelon of Ghibli flicks. But when Miyazaki created Princess Mononoke, he took a more nuanced approach. He did something exceedingly rare in an environmental film. He empathized with the human antagonists. There are indeed humans in this film who only seek to exploit the forest for their own personal gain, but there are also humans like Lady Eboshi, who through industry has created prosperity for her town of misfits and outcasts. In a different story, she would be the protagonist. Here, she is severely flawed, but she's meant to be related to. The protagonist fights neither for innovation nor for nature, but for peace between the two. This is not a warning to not advance, but rather a call for balance. Humanity will always be compelled to progress, argues the film. So there will always be conflict between the human world and the natural world, but humanity must stop that conflict from spilling into chaos, or it will only destroy itself and nature. This is the rawest, most unapologetically complicated, and emphatically non-polemic environmental message I've ever heard delivered. And it's wrapped up in some of the best dramatic storytelling ever crafted, not only in anime or in film, but ever. Great environmental art should not only promote the protection of the environment, but also give serious, mature attention to these issues. There's nothing wrong with being an open partisan when making this kind of film, or really any kind of film, but be a partisan with an analytical perspective. Great environmental art doesn't just spout a position, it analyzes all sides of the debate. This makes for better art and better argument. This makes for a work that can't be brushed aside as thin or one-dimensional or vapid.
Epic battle rages between the encroaching civilization of man and the gods of the forest.
Some would argue that all environmental films are beneficial because they introduce these ideas to a wider audience. So, according to this line of thinking, even though these films are simplistic, they convince an audience of the need of protecting the environment, particularly kids who may only be responsive to environmentalism in the form of fiction. But I vehemently disagree with this philosophy, which I often see in activist culture. Vapid depictions of environmentalism can do serious harm. People who go to see an environmentalist film are likely to be people already predisposed toward environmentalism, and there's nothing wrong with this. A movement does not need to convert everyone to its side to achieve victory. The people already agree with the film that environmentalism matters, which makes them more receptive to the message, which means the exact message matters. If the message is simply that a select group of individuals is responsible, then the audience will be likely to blame only those individuals and not seek structural change. The audience will let themselves be fooled by those who spout environmentalist rhetoric, but seek consolation rather than confrontation with the enemies of environmentalism. More damagingly, bad films can distort our perception of what these enemies look like. This is sadly what's happened with fascism. If you ask someone if Nazis are bad, they'll say yes, of course, but if you ask them why, you'll almost always merely get a list of what they did, and the problems of Nazism and fascism in general are as deep as the ideologies themselves. But blockbuster art never comprehends these, or really any ideologies, and instead merely portrays Nazis as doing terrible things merely because they're evil. This is bad because it means that if fascists want to continue being fascist without being criticized, they can merely declare themselves to be not fascist, and that'll be good enough for the average citizen. Anti-environmentalists must be portrayed as actual people, not because they deserve sympathy, but because otherwise they will bear no resemblance to their real-world counterparts. Wow, that was heavy, but important. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more meditative content. Also, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe, all that balanced stuff. Adios, comrades!